Hello, Lindsey Burrows. We have met a while ago, 6 months ago, and I am very honoured that you've come to join us on the Therapy Works podcast. I thought it might be better if you introduced yourself.
Hi, Julia. Firstly, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's such a huge honour. So just to introduce myself, my name is Lindsey Burrow. I'm the widow of the former rugby legend, Rob Burrow, who sadly passed away from motor neurone disease in June 2024.
As you said, Lindsey, you're the wife of Rob Burrow, who is a sort of legendary rugby player who died of motor neurone disease. But the question I ask all my guests is, what is the greatest challenge you have faced or are facing? And maybe that will help us understand what's been going on if you begin to tell me what, right now, him having died last year, middle of last year, what is it that you're facing? Where are you at today?
Yeah, so it's been a tough 7 months since Rob's passing. I think a lot of the anticipatory grief for me had already been done because Rob was diagnosed back in December 2019. And suddenly that's when life is never going to be the same again, because suddenly you're hit with a life-limiting illness. Rob was told at the time that he'd have maybe a year or 2 years to live at most.
So he doubled that.
He doubled that, yeah. He was determined to accept the diagnosis, but to fight the prognosis. And, you know, I think he'd defied the odds throughout his rugby career in terms of, you know, he was told he was always too small to make it. He was never going to make it as a rugby player. You know, the image of a big rugby player against Rob, who was 5'5" tall, was never, you know, he wasn't your typical sort of rugby player. And so he had that adversity growing up that he was always told he would never make it. And I think he was determined to prove the doctors and the medical teams wrong by being here. And he had so many reasons to live. You know, he'd got 3 beautiful children, and he just wanted to make the most of each and every single day that he had with us. And I think that's the lesson, certainly, that I've taken from Rob, is that to live in the moment, to appreciate life, and just make the most of each and every day, because never in our wildest dreams did we imagine that we would be sitting in a consultation room with a doctor being told that, you know, you have motor neuron disease. You have all these plans of growing old together and all these retirement plans. And, you know, we've got 3 beautiful children. We've both been successful in our careers. And Rob had finished playing professional rugby and had gone into coaching, and all those aspirations. Suddenly, you know, life is never going to be the same. So I think going back to the original question of what's the challenge, I think for me is that change in identity from being a couple to suddenly being a single person, to suddenly being, you know, a single parent, a single mum. And I found that really challenging. I think not just because I'm dealing with my own grief, the loss of my spouse, my husband, somebody that I've been with for the past 20 years. Suddenly they're not there anymore, but also how to deal with the grief of 3 young children who have not really experienced grief or bereavement or loss in their lives. We did lose my grandparent during COVID. Obviously, during COVID, that was very difficult because you couldn't go to funerals. We hadn't seen my nana for some time because of, you know, social distancing. We weren't allowed. So this was our real, and being a parent, it's just not something that you kind of plan on in life, and it's not really part of the plan that we envisaged. So to kind of get that diagnosis at such a young age, and Rob, pound for pound, was probably one of the strongest rugby players that you could, you know, was the fittest, the strongest player in the team. And then to suddenly being told that you're in a situation where there's going to come a time where you can't walk, you can't talk, you can't feed yourself, to be so dependent on somebody, you know, it's just life changing. So I think initially for me, it was the shock of the diagnosis. And
what's your reaction in shock personally? Do you freeze? Do you just keep marching on and don't think about it? How do you manage shock personally?
Yeah, I think for me I took the shock and the hardest because of the fact that I work in the NHS, and I knew that the path that we were going to be taking, or the path that we were on. And I think
I went into Chelsea. What was your role in the NHS?
I work as a physiotherapist within the NHS. So although I don't work directly with people with MND, I work within musculoskeletal physiotherapy with spinal injuries. I had seen patients before, so I had some insight of the disease, and I knew that kind of the path that lay ahead, whereas I think
So
Rob
you
was
knew
very
too much in a way.
I knew too much, yeah. So I think for me, my initial thought was, how are we going to tell the children? What are we going to tell the children? In true Rob style, he was more bothered about, it'll be okay. I'll be okay. Thank goodness it was me and not you or the children. And that was his sort of initial reaction to the diagnosis. But I think having that insight into the medical was very different for me. And I think initially it hit me harder. Simple things like, I'd gone to the bank to put my card machine into the bank and I couldn't remember the PIN number, a simple PIN number, 4-number digit that I'd used, hundreds and hundreds of times in the past. And I just broke down inconsolably, upset. And that was kind of, that initial period of kind of the shock and not sleeping, having no appetite. That's how it really affected me.
Yeah.
It's grief, yeah. So I think, now, I think a lot of my grieving was done in the early stages of Rob's diagnosis because I knew what lied ahead. I knew what we were in for, and I'm very realistic in terms of the outcome, I think.
In some ways, the ignorance of the children and Rob kept them in the present, whereas you knew you had a real image. You weren't thrown into a completely alien landscape, although you were personally, but professionally you had an idea. So you knew what was coming in a way that they probably couldn't imagine. And so in some ways, feeling the pain of that, I imagine you had to kind of operate on two levels. You had to kind of be functional as a mum and supporting Rob. And also there's often in couples, there's this dual thing of, I'm upset that you're the one that's ill. Am I allowed to be upset? Or do I have to be the one that's supporting you the whole time? And you as a healthcare professional, as a physio, your inclination, I imagine, would be always to help the other. So did you kind of lose your capacity to look after yourself? Did you get worn down? What happened?
Yeah, I think I did. I think soon as, initially Rob was still quite well at the time of his diagnosis. So it manifests itself in his speech. So physically, he was still able, to coach the academy team at Leeds Rhinos. He was still able to, carry the children and do things with the children. So physically, he didn't need that much. So I think initially for me, it was that emotional part and kind of accepting the diagnosis at that point. And then probably into about 6 months into Rob's diagnosis, that's the point where he needed more physical care. So I had to help him with feeding, with toileting, with dressing. And then that sort of became the norm. So then you become the carer.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting because obviously you've gone from being a wife and having that identity as a couple when suddenly...
And physical relations.
Yeah. Things, just wanting a hug or, Rob couldn't do that, or communication was a big issue because he had to communicate through specialist technology and a communication device. He lost the ability to speak. So that has a huge impact on the relationship. Very much so. And I was always very cautious that Rob was involved in conversations, whether that be, with the family or with, when his teammates used to come round, because it was very easy for you to kind of just talk over Rob because it took him so much effort to be able to join in that conversation. And it was always so quick-witted and, suddenly he can't do that anymore when he's basically paralysed in a body that doesn't work, whereas he's still all there mentally. And that was so frustrating for me, but I can only imagine how frustrating that must have been for Rob. Simple things like being able to tell the children that he loved them or being able to read them a bedtime story. Suddenly, he no longer able to do those things. And how he kept his positivity and his positive mindset is, he's just an inspiration to us all because he never looked for self-pity. He never said, why me? He just got on with life the best he could. And I think on the days now where I do have a down day or I am feeling a bit sorry for myself, I look at Rob and what he achieved, and that soon puts life into perspective.
I can really understand that. I'm also kind of fascinated that you very quickly talk about Rob and not talk about yourself.
Yeah, that's been said a few times before. Yeah, I think that's just me. I'm quite a shy, just ordinary working class girl. And I think to suddenly, be thrown into the limelight, to suddenly kind of open your doors and show the world the reality and the brutality of living with MND has certainly pushed me out of my comfort zone. And it has been said before that I tend to offload onto, Rob, but I think he was such an inspiration to me. And I'm so fortunate to have been Rob's wife for 17 years, been married to Rob for 17 years. And, that's what I kind of focus on now. And it's not about me. And I think being a carer, all your time is invested in making sure that the person's looked after, making sure that they're happy and their well-being. And so you don't really think about yourself. And I still put myself in that role now because the children are my priority, and making sure that they're happy and that they're looked after is my number one priority. So I think carers is such a big topic at the moment, and I'm really keen to shine a light on the work that carers do, having been a carer for Rob and seeing, I think, sometimes the loneliness and the isolation that carers face is really important.
So if we can try and turn to you, what are the aspects that you personally and psychologically find most difficult? And then the other side of it, what is the thing that supported you to manage the difficulty?
So the most difficult part is being on my own and not having that person to turn to, if you've had a bad day, just to kind of offload to that person and put the world to rights. And talk about the children, if they're having, a fallout with friends at school or something, what would you do in this situation? Well, what would you do? So I think it's not having that person to kind of bounce those ideas off, to get that reassurance together. So I think that is probably the most challenging part. If you're having a bad day, for somebody to give you a hug or, just put their arm around you and say, we'll be okay, everything will be okay.
I mean, I imagine you have an internal voice of Rob that you could ask him and you'd know what he'd say to you.
Absolutely. And what he'd said, I'd probably do the opposite anyway. It was always the case of if you're going out somewhere, Rob, which dress should I wear? And whichever one you chose, I choose the opposite. So, but no, I think, Rob has been such a huge inspiration, and we were together for so long, and we were like two peas in a pod really, because neither of us liked the limelight. We were very shy, just kind of ordinary people. And I think we're very grounded, very similar in our upbringings, in our family values. We didn't particularly like going out drinking. We weren't, we were quite boring in many ways, I have to say. But that just suited us. And I think hopefully there's nothing wrong with being boring.
Well, I think the word boring is the wrong word. I think it's much more that you're happy and content in who you are and that you're stable. And so that you don't need lots of external kind of drama or excitement in order to feel happy and engaged in your world, but you kind of like the world that you're in. But apart from Rob and his inspiration, people listening who maybe have a partner that has a life-limiting, life-threatening illness, not necessarily motor neuron, but what is it that helped you that maybe they could learn from?
So my focus was around obviously looking after Rob, looking after myself. And one way I did that was through exercise. So I trained to run my first marathon, which coincidentally was a Rob Burrow Leeds Marathon. And I took on the challenge of fundraising for the Leeds Hospitals charity. So yeah, really proud of myself for doing that. And I think actually the exercise and going out for a run and just having that headspace, whether it be half an hour or an hour, however long I had for going out and doing the exercise. And I've continued to do that. And I think that's my escapism from...
Is it like your therapy?
It is, yes. Yeah. Putting on a playlist and going out for a run has definitely been my escapism. And it just gives me that headspace to go out and just, collect my thoughts. And I don't know what it is, but I think perhaps the endorphin, release of going out and doing some physical exercise. And I think that's helped me massively throughout this times. But I also think as well, communication and talking. And it's so important to have friends and family around you in these difficult times to help. And, I couldn't have got through the last 4.5 years without the support of my family and friends. And whether it was to help with the children or just to offload if you had a bad day or to ask for some advice. And I'm aware that a lot of people don't have that support mechanism. They don't have that communication. And I think it's so important to have those channels of communication.
Being able to be honest and also have someone else who, like your mum and dad, I remember when we spoke think your mum was there to help, because the juggle of being a single parent and managing, you actually physically need another pair of hands, but you also need parents that love you, that are going to look after you and that you can turn to. It makes such an enormous difference.
Absolutely. And I think for the children as well, it's important that they have those male figures in their life, particularly Jackson and the girls, our son. It's really important that they have, their uncles and the grandparents, because, I think I took on the role of trying to be mum and dad. And actually that wasn't the right thing to do. I just needed to be their mum. But in that time, I'm thinking they've lost a dad. Right, I need to play mum and dad here. And actually, no, you don't need to play mum and dad. You just need to be there and be mum.
Yeah, and get other male figures in, whether it's uncles or friends or grandparents. So how are the children? How have they been over these 3 years? I mean, it's quite a reckoning for them, isn't it? It's quite a challenge.
It is. I am so, so proud of our 3 children. So we've got 3 children, Macy, Maya and Jackson. They, I think in many ways, they're so much like the dad. They're brave, they're courageous, they're resilient. They just get on with life. They wake up every morning with big, beautiful smiles on their face. And they just live life to the fullest. And there has been times we've been on that roller coaster where they bitterly miss the dad. So Maya, for example, sleeps every night with a little knitted heart that she got given at the hospital. Jackson carries a little worry worm with him to school. So again, it was given to him the night before Rob passed away, and he keeps it in his school bag, his little worry worm. So they have things like that. But yeah, it's just managing to deal. And I think one of the hardest things for me is not just managing my own grief, but also managing the grief of the children and how they respond. And I know we talked about before, Julie, how children tend to puddle jump. So one minute they might be sad, and then the next minute they're happy. And that's definitely manifested in the children, Jackson.
But not at the same time.
Not at the same time, no, absolutely. And then sometimes it can be little things and unexpected. I remember going to the cinema, and we hadn't even been sort of talking about Rob at the time. And it was just Jackson got out of the car and just in floods of tears. And I said, Jackson, what's the matter? Why are you sad? And he was just, I miss my dad. I want my dad. And it's so hard over Christmas. He was looking out of the window and looking up at the stars in the sky. And first Christmas without Rob was particularly tough. Rob loved Christmas as much as the kids. And, in my head, I had the visions of Rob running down the stairs in the morning saying, had he been? Let me go and check, see if he's been. And, not the emptiness, I think. And I think sitting back as a parent and seeing the children open the presents was particularly heart-wrenching, because I tried to make it as special as I could for the children, but not having Rob there was, this is, I think the reality kind of just, yes, yeah, absolutely.
That presence of absence is so kind of pulsating, isn't it?
Yes. And I really felt that Christmas, I think going to Rob's parents, as we kept to the same routine of, opening the presents, having morning at home, and then going up to see Rob's parents. And as soon as I walked through the door, I suddenly felt, I could feel the emotion. I could feel myself, being choked up. And it was almost kind of like, right, let's just, try and not break Rob's rule of no tears policy. But, that was the inevitable was going to happen. And Christmas Day was particularly tough. But we got through it, and the kids had a great day, which was the main thing. But yeah, it was a particularly tough day.
I bet it was particularly tough. And tell me about the no tears policy. Was that what? Also, is it Northern?
It probably is, yeah. I think so. It actually came about quite early after Rob's diagnosis, probably a couple of weeks after. Rob and his good friend Kevin Sinfield went up to see rugby union player Doddy Weir up in Carlisle. And the late Doddy was a fellow MND warrior who did a lot of work around campaigning and raising his awareness of MND. And he very kindly agreed to meet with Rob. And it was almost like that light bulb moment that Rob came back and he was ready to fight the disease. And Rob said, right, that's it, no more tears now. So I think what Doddy did in that meeting was kind of instill hope in him and gave Rob hope. And that was a real turning point where Rob said, no more tears. We can't change the diagnosis, but we can make the most of each and every day that we have together. And I just thought to myself, well, if Rob can have that mindset, he's the one that's going through this, he's the one that's got, MND hanging over his head, then I can be positive, and I can be positive for Rob, and I will be positive for Rob, and we'll get through this the best we can, and we'll continue to make those memories and live each day to the fullest. And looking back now and reflecting on what Rob achieved and what we achieved together in terms of raising awareness and the fundraising, I feel very proud.
Yeah. And did you follow that? I mean, I can't imagine all that time, 4 years of not having tears.
On the whole, yes, I stuck to it. Was difficult at times. Birthdays, Christmas, because, in the back of your mind, you're always thinking,
is this the last one?
Is this the last one? Yeah. And I knew Rob thought that, but I think some ways it was almost because I didn't want to upset Rob. So sometimes I think you hide your emotion because you don't want to upset the other person.
Yeah. So you kind of protect each other from the tears. And this may be an inappropriate question, so you can certainly ignore me. But on the podcast, I've interviewed someone whose husband also had motor neuron disease, and he went to Dignitas. And she's been campaigning for the assisted dying bill. And I wondered, from your experience, what are your thoughts around that? And have you got any thoughts around that?
I'm very much on the fence, I have to say. I think because those conversations with Rob were so difficult. Rob was very live here in the now, I'll deal with the future when it comes. And I always remember that consultation. It's on the BBC documentary where, the consultant's talking about Rob's wishes and the future. And she says, oh, would you plan for a game? And Rob says, I would plan for the next game, but I won't plan for a game 6 weeks in advance. So those conversations were really difficult with Rob. And I know how much he
really kept it in the day.
He kept it in the day, absolutely. And he loved life, and the thought of not being able to see the children reach those milestones in terms of, high school, I think that positive mental imaging is what kept Rob going. And he used that a lot, I think, in his rugby career as well. He'd vision scoring a try over the line, he'd vision winning a cup or winning a trophy. And I think he very much did that in his battle with MND. He had that positive mental imaging of seeing the children reach those milestones, and that very much kept him going. So the thought of Rob kind of choosing to end his life, it would never have come. He wanted to be here for as long as he possibly could. He wanted to spend each and every single day, each and every single minute with the children. And despite the suffering, I don't think there would have ever come a point where Rob would have chosen to end his life. So there's kind of that emotional part of me. And then there's obviously the other side, which, it's such a difficult question. And I think I sit somewhere on the fence of it. So I'm sorry, that's a really rubbish answer to the question.
It's honest. Yeah. You can see there are circumstances for some people that it would be a choice that they'd want to be able to be given, even if they didn't choose to take it.
Absolutely. And I think until you're in that person's shoes, it's very difficult to make that decision. It's very difficult to say, what would I do in that situation? Because I think until you're actually in that person's shoes, living in that person's shoes, that it's very difficult to say, what should you do? What would you do?
And what I'm aware of, Lindsey, is that kind of positive mindset of keep it in the day and the manifestation, I'm going to live as best I can for as long as I can. No tears. Take the joy, don't be sad. And that, as you're smiling at me as I'm saying that, like, you've swallowed that whole too. So as a therapist, we deal with pain, right? People who are happy and joyful don't come and see us. So I'm wondering where the tears go, where your sadness goes, how you manage. And also, even if Rob didn't ask why me, did you have questions like a fury of why Rob or why us? Or
initially in those early days, why us? What have we done? What has Rob done to deserve this? Because he's such a good person inside and out, and he was just the most kind, caring, loving person, and you just think this is so unfair. Why has this happened? And I think it's the anger, the frustration. And again, I think that's part of that grieving process whereby you've been given this diagnosis and you feel angry. If you want somebody to blame for that news, and it's that realization of this, this is happening. You don't ever think this is going to happen to you or to your family. So I remember one instance, and it was probably a day or two after Rob's diagnosis, and just almost collapsing in the kitchen because I just felt, so angry. I felt so upset. I remember holding Jackson and just furious. Yeah, the anger, the upset, and, holding Jackson at night and just holding him so tight that I just felt life was so unfair, that this wasn't, this is not fair. Why is this happening to us? We don't deserve this. We're good people. Why has this happened? So I think, early and definitely in the early diagnosis. And actually it's really interesting because at Rob's funeral, the girls were the first one to speak. And I know how they'd written a little speech about Rob and about the father. And I knew how much they wanted to deliver this speech. And I remember Maisha saying to me afterwards, "Mummy, why didn't you cry when we saw the coffin? Mummy, why didn't you cry at the funeral?" And she was right to ask that question, because why didn't I cry? And I did cry in the funeral and inside, and my heart was broken. But I knew that they had to go and do that speech, and I knew how much it meant to them. And I just thought, actually, if they see me cry,
it'll break them down.
I think it'll break them. And they were going to be the first people to speak at the funeral. And I just know, in years to come, I hope that will give, and it did. And the strength and resilience shone through them when they got up and read the eulogies that they'd written for Rob. But it was just, and afterwards, and then that has taught me such a big lesson about it's okay to be sad. And now I find myself, I'll say, "Oh, this song came on the radio the other day and it made me feel sad because it made me remember Daddy." So I try and almost kind of now give them the opportunity to be sad. Yeah, to puddle jump, which I wouldn't have done before, because Rob kind of taught us to be positive. He said, "There's no tears, we don't cry, and we put on this positive front. But actually, it's okay to cry. It's okay to be sad." And I think sharing that with the children is so important, because it just gives them that channel to actually say, "Mum, I'm feeling sad today." And I found the more open I am with the children, the more open they are with me. And actually they're willing, because they know it's okay to feel sad. And there will be days of sadness. There'll be lots of days of happiness. But equally, on occasions, or it might just be little things, as I say, hearing a song on the radio or going to a rugby match or something that reminds them of the dad. They're always going to have those reminders. And what we've set up now is a little memory box in the house. So we put little memories in of Rob, so we keep his memory. We talk about him. You're a model to the children. And if they see you, holding everything in and bottling everything up inside, then
that's what they'll think they have to do.
Yes, absolutely.
Feels like you've kind of explored to get the information that will support your kids.
Absolutely. And it's been a roller coaster of emotions and such a big learning curve for me, personally as well as emotionally. But knowing that hopefully we can get through this and get the children through this, and just being there and learning so much about myself as well in the process.
What's the big thing that you learned about yourself?
I think to wear my heart on my sleeve, and to be open, and to not bottle things up, and just to be honest, I think, with the children. And we always have been honest with the children, even from the early diagnosis. We've always given that, in an age appropriate way, we've told them and kept them involved. And I think that's so important as well, because I think when you don't tell them, that's when the trust goes and the children start to ask questions. So that was really important, that we've always been honest and open with the children. But I think, that vulnerability of actually saying, "I'm not okay today. No. Today's a bad day."
I feel sad or angry or upset.
Yeah, absolutely. And learning to do that and knowing that it's okay, and that's not a sign of weakness.
No. Do you have a picture of a future for you and the family? I mean, also including in that picture is, I guess, something that most people don't have to accommodate is Rob's sort of public face. Like, his funeral felt like a state funeral. There were thousands of people and it was in the media. So do you have an idea of how you're going to navigate both keeping Rob's memory alive, private as a family man, public as a figure that is a great sportsman, but also representative of resilience, of MND? Do you have a picture of your future?
The future for me, what I hope is that the children are happy and successful in life, whatever that might be. As long as they're happy, then I'm happy. For me personally, I'm really keen to continue Rob's legacy. So we have the specialist M&D care centre that will be opening in summer in Rob's name. So
amazing.
Really excited to, so that's over £6.8 million has been raised to build the centre.
My goodness, what a thing.
And I'm running the London Marathon this year. I'm running the Rob Burrow Marathon 2 weeks later. So I'm going to continue my fundraising to raise money for the centre. And that will go to families similar to ours that have been affected by MND. So I'm keen to be involved with the work that the centre does in the future. And just keeping Rob's legacy alive, keep hope. I'm really keen to shine a light on the work that unpaid carers do and the role that they have to play in society. So that's really, really keen to do that. And I've obviously got the book that comes out, Take Care, that comes out at the end of February, which again, hopefully will shine a light on the work the unpaid carers do.
Tell us a bit about the book.
So the book is ultimately, it's the story of my life with Rob as we face the devastating diagnosis of motor neuron disease. And I wanted to write a testament to the strength of love, resilience, and of the human spirit, and just in the power of family in times of adversity. So it's for anyone that's a love story. It is, yeah, and it goes back right from the childhood. So I grew up in the miners' strike. Both my dad and my grandparents were miners. So there's lots of stories in there of my granddad in the field pinching the potatoes and us queuing up at the soup kitchen to get our sort of family meals, and right through Rob's diagnosis, right up until his final days. I think what's unusual about Take Care is that I've been very open, honest, and probably exposed my vulnerability in the book, really, in being so honest and in sharing. But I think that's been a huge process for me because I started writing the book in February, and Rob was obviously still with us at the time. And Rob was a real reason that I decided to do the book, because he was the one that said, I think you should do this. I think you've got a voice and should use that voice to help other carers. And that was my primary aim of doing the book, was to try and help other people that may be in a similar situation in the future. And I thought if telling my story can help one other person or one other family, then that's good enough reason for me to do the book. I found it really reflective, and actually going through and knowing that I'd done everything that I possibly could for Rob, but actually going through that has helped me massively in my grieving.
Quite therapeutic.
And absolutely to go through, and right from the childhood memories right up until, the present day at the time of writing the book, has really helped me through that grieving process.
I can imagine actually finding words to describe what is often inchoate, that often difficult to describe, but also looking at the roots of who you are from a miner's granddaughter and a daughter, in a way being born into adversity, because if you're born into the miners' strike, there was a lot of poverty, a lot of rage, a lot of difficulty, and in some way that shaped you into who you are, that enabled you to do this, I guess. Because love is what you got from your parents, even if they were stealing potatoes to feed you.
You'd be amazed at how many meals you can make from potatoes, I think. I think it's a real sort of testament to love and family, and how the power of family. And that's, I think, my upbringing has shaped who I am today.
So, Lindsey, I've got a quote from Rob, which was the quote. He said to your 3 children, is this right? In a world full of adversity, we must all dare to dream.
Yes, that's a quote that Rob said. Just such a beautiful quote. And I think that just kind of summarises Rob, and I couldn't have put it any better myself. I think, no matter how hard life gets, we can always find a way to keep going and to take care of those people that we love.
That's a lovely way to end the conversation. Thank you, Lindsey, so much.
Thank you.
Hello, Sophie Samuel. Last time it was you and Emily without me, and now it is you and me without Emily. She's on a course. I was on a course. Lovely to see you.
Nice to see you. We missed you.
I've listened to it. I thought you were really good. So we're going to talk about the very moving conversation I had with Lindsey Burrow, Rob Burrow's widow, and that he had MND. I think, first of all, for me, it was interesting that we've had 2 guests this season whose husbands died of motor neuron disease, which is a very rare disease. But how they responded was so very different from each other.
Which I think made me think, this interview with Lindsey, what a lovely woman, was so soon, 7 months, was it, after his death? Is that right?
Yes, he died last summer.
And I think our other guest, she was a year after. And I was thinking about, I think people generally know now that there's not a normal form of grieving, that everybody grieves differently. And that's something that you talk about, isn't it, Mum? But I did wonder what your thoughts have been about prolonged grief disorder. So prolonged grief disorder, for people listening, if they don't know, is the DSM-5 diagnosis for someone who'd been grieving. That someone needs to have died for at least a year before they can receive this diagnosis, and showing certain signs or symptoms of struggling with their grief, such that they're finding it hard to function in their everyday life, such as struggling to see friends or lots of preoccupation. We can go into detail if that's helpful, but this obviously isn't about these two people that we've spoken to who seem to be doing incredibly well. But I did make me think of people listening with their grief. I think often people have questions like, is this normal? And whether you think it's a useful diagnosis. And if it is, I don't know. I just wondered what your thoughts were about the idea of diagnosing prolonged grief disorder and how people think about how are you supposed to be when? Because I can imagine people listening to those 2 episodes and thinking, gosh, people do grieve so differently, even when the illness is the same.
Yes, so I think that's really important, that our grief is both universal and there are universal aspects of it that we can all recognize. And it is also very unique depending on the relationship with the person, our own psychological makeup, our own history, the circumstances of the death, and the support we get at the time of the loss. I think what's useful about the DSM diagnosis is that it puts grief on the map as something that people can really struggle with. Whereas I think sometimes it's just being dismissed, like we all grieve, we learn to get over it, we're wired to be adaptive, and it's sort of not treated seriously. I think the stuckness of complicated grief and the grief disorder is the lack of functioning, is that, and there's often trauma involved. There is often very little support for the person who's grieving. So one of the blockers of grieving is real guilt and rumination. And so that can be with the circumstances or the relationship that you had, because you want to kind of go back and fix the past and you can't, and you get stuck in this kind of mindset. I think in the US, it's important because it means people can get insurance for support, which they can't without a DSM diagnosis. And a lot of people are angry about it because it's saying that it pathologizes a natural adaptive process and makes it like an illness. And I think everybody has a point. I mean, I think all the points are true.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously diagnosis is a controversial thing for lots of people. But I also wonder if sometimes we can... It's also the meaning that we put on diagnosis, isn't it? Where I think often our default understanding of a diagnosis can be on an emotional level, even if not on a rational level, is that there's something wrong with me, that this diagnosis says there's something wrong with me. Whereas really, I think what you're saying, Mark, is that by being able to describe someone struggling in their grief and identifying certain markers of struggle, really what ideally we're trying to say is, or maybe a way that someone can think about it, is things have happened in the story of your grief that have made this process more complex and needs more support, therefore. Really, it's a call for support. The way that we work is we have an NHS, you need to access certain treatments, you need a diagnosis, etc.
So it's a portal in order to get the support, isn't it? It's a way in to support.
Yes, and if you are struggling with grief, you've in a sort of place of stuckness, it will be for a reason. Not that there's something wrong with you. That's not the reason. The reason will be for all the things you've talked about, a lack of support, the complexity, trauma involved, your own history, all those things that make it natural and normal for you to then struggle with an experience like this, given what came into that moment, rather than this more pathological story of the wrongness is somehow in you. Anyway, this is a big digression, sorry, from Lindsey.
I think what's relevant, and I hope can be useful for people listening, is that I think one of the most common and also most difficult aspects of grieving is that the mourners turn against themselves and criticize themselves, and they compare themselves to some kind of external curated version that I should be like this, or I should be feeling this, or I should be. And they may compare themselves to Lindsey and Lottie, who are both kind of having their own unique process. And I think what's really important is, comparison is a route to misery, but to support yourself where you're at with what you're processing at the time. And I think what was really wonderful about both of them, but Lindsey in this particular conversation, was she was so truly herself. She knew a lot about this illness because she worked in the NHS. She did a lot of her grieving while Rob was still alive, anticipatory grief, and did the no sleeping, the not even able to eat, the kind of raging. And to some extent that enabled her to manage the living loss of him degeneratively changing in front of her eyes, because she allowed herself to feel what she felt.
Yes, grief is one word, but there's so many ways in which people die. And there's so many different types of journeys that people go on in that process. We've had two of those, Lottie and Lindsey, talking about this, a particularly prolonged version of dying, isn't there, with something like MND, where so much of the adjustment happens before. And yet, I'm not surprised that what she was saying was most challenging now is being a single parent. Because for all the sort of processes of grief she was able to do and went through before he died, this thing of being fully on your own is a shock that only really comes after death, however sort of incapacitated someone is. And I was thinking a bit about that shift into becoming a single parent from having had a partner, and that how many levels it can hit on for someone. Because obviously there's the practical level of now you have to do everything yourself,
the school run and
the juggle. Yeah. But then there's the sort of emotional responsibility that now you hold solely as a single parent. Yeah. There's also an identity
and only
piece.
You as parents feel that, even you've got grandparents or siblings, but it is very unique, that love of a parent, isn't it? That only you two can share.
Yeah. And that sense of sort of inherent in sort of in your cells sense of emotional responsibility for the well-being of your child. And but there's also identity, suddenly being a single person in the world, and then how alone and lonely you can feel. There's just so many layers to that. And then how the world then treats you. People get treated very differently, whether they're a single parent who previously had a partner or not. And so there's so many challenges it presents on top of grief.
And I think that's certainly true, that your status in the world is very different as a single parent to a couple, particularly as a couple with Rob as a very successful athlete. And I think one of the aspects that we sometimes don't fully acknowledge in grief is the kind of future that you expected to have and that you're grieving for. That she would grow old together as a couple, they would see their children grow up and develop into the kind of adults that they become. And that's such a complicated grief to grieve, because it's a dream and you have to make the adjustment of not only am I not going to have that future, but I have to remodel myself and create a new identity as a single woman, as a single mum, that creates a new future, which is not the future I fucking signed up for. And so how do I get past that and let myself and give myself permission to love again, to hope again, to rebuild my life? I've worked with so many single parents who are just raging. I didn't feel Lindsey's rage actually, but maybe that'll come. Maybe she hasn't got angry yet.
It comes in phases. Yes, there's so much sort of emotional labour involved, isn't there? And I can imagine how resentful people must feel that not only do I need to figure out how to be with this pain and accommodate this loss, then to actually live again, I have to do this whole process of opening up again and reimagining
and dating
and coping and having a sense of possibility. And God, I just can't be bothered, you know?
The other thing that I thought was actually very useful, and, you know, I talk a lot about pain being the agent of change and allowing yourself to feel the pain. And I think there is another side to that coin that I don't acknowledge, which is Rob's positive mental imaging that he used for his career as a rugby player, but then he used as a kind of template to manage the MND and his grief, which was, you know, he couldn't fight the diagnosis, but he would fight the prognosis, and that he would picture himself and rehearse picturing himself being well for longer. And I think that there's a lot of evidence about positive mental imaging that doesn't, I don't mean ignore the pain of things, but to use it as a way into yourself to build the image of how you want to be can be extremely helpful. And I think particularly for someone like Rob, you know, who I think maybe it's too much to feel the pain with MND, and that actually you have to do what you've always done and build on how you've always coped. And you can't change how you emotionally manage things. And that did, I mean, who knows, but that sort of felt very important.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because in a way we talk a lot about allowing yourself to feel the pain, because often that's the thing that obviously we naturally resist because nobody wants to feel pain. But we probably don't talk very much about the bit where you jump out of the puddle and what you can do to either help yourself jump out of the puddle other than feel it, but also what that can look like, because there's distraction, there's laughter, there's time with friends, but something like positive imagery like that, or having a safe place that you go to in your mind, or whatever kind of psychological and human resources that you might find, things that you're passionate about. For me, it would be like dancing, that you just know, shift your gear in a different way. That, you know, you sort of want to, you know, acknowledge and awareness for yourself that there are for how to do that too, because people also get stuck in the pain, or because they're frightened because they don't know how to get out of it, they don't want to go in because it feels like, well, I don't know how to get out, so I'm just not going to go in. But then I think the other piece is, and I think you probably agree, Mum, or I see it a lot, is often in when something is happening, you are often, and only can really be, in survival mode. And it's often then only when the crisis of whatever that might be is ended that it is possible to process it in a more present with the pain kind of way.
You have to have the safety.
Sometimes you're getting through, and that is all that can be done at that time.
I've worked with people who've grieved 5-6 years after, because at the time all they could do was survive. And so I think that's a really important point.
And you also get adults who don't get to grieve their parents or siblings they lost when they were children.
Exactly. So, Myso, thank you so much for being so thoughtful. And Lindsey, thank you so much for coming on and being so open, and for writing your wonderful book, which is a #1 bestseller. Congratulations. And thank you all for listening.